Okay, the first thing we're going to do with our pillowcase, the first step is to fold our hem in half lengthwise, creating a piece that's 5.5 by 41. And then we're going to press that in half. So what we want to do is actually press that so that it's wrong sides together, so that the pretty side, the bright side of the fabric is going to be facing the outside once the seam is pressed. So I have my hem fabric here. And this fabric is hard to tell a wrong side and a right side. So I see that my tailor's chalk sort of left a mark when the iron hit it. So I'm going to pretend that's my wrong side there. So I'm going to fold the edges so that they meet. That should wash out in the wash. I don't really have that issue very often, so I'm not too worried about it. Definitely you would test your tailor's chalk on a piece of your fabric, on a scrap, before you have a nice project done. Okay, so the edges are together. And I'm just going to press it all the way across. Okay, so on to step 2, skip trim. We have to fold that in half also. Right sides are facing out when we're done, so it's wrong sides together when we're pressing it here. Just line up the edges of the fabric as best you can so they're as even as possible, and press. Kind of drive with the tip of your iron in the lead. Okay, now we're actually going to leave this purple trim piece folded when we unfold the hem. So the instructions tell us to unfold our hem piece here. So then the right sides will be facing up. And then we're going to take our trim piece, here's the raw edges and here's the fold, and we're going to line it up with just one side of our hem. All you do is line up the raw edges of both fabrics. So there's 3 layers you're lining up, because there's 2 of the purple trim here, and there's 1 of the hem. So sometimes it's not quite the right same length here. Let's see if I can pull it here. Sometimes it's not quite exactly right. So I like to just sort of work from the center out. And then if I have to trim that off later, I can, because I want all of my edges to be the same. So we're going to actually baste this together with a really long, loose, straight stitch. So I like to pin just a few. Remember, you want to be able to pull your pins out from the right side when you're driving with your sewing machine. Make sure that your fabrics are stacked exactly on top of each other. Okay, so now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and do a really long basting stitch. So here's how we do a basting stitch. Over here on my seam, my stitch selector, here is my stitch length. I can go shorter or longer. So I am just going to hit the long button until it goes all the way up and stops. That will give me the longest stitch possible on my machine. And all I'm going to do is keep the edge of my presser foot on the edge of my fabric. We don't want a regular seam allowance when we're basting, because then we have to take out those stitches because they'll show in the seam allowance. So I'm just going to go with the edge of my presser foot as my guide. And also you do not need to reverse to anchor this stitch. So I'm just going to start driving and it'll be straight to the other end. See, we have longer stitches now than we had before. Okay, now I did not reverse at the end either, so we have a long basting stitch. Okay, trim my tails because if you don't, they will just get tangled in the next step. So it's always good to trim your thread tails. Okay. Okay, here's the next step. So now this is step number 5, which is this illustration right here. And so what we have to do now is lay our case fabric out, so our main fabric. And we want this actually right side up when we are laying it out. And then what we're going to do is place this fabric into a sandwich, which means the right side, this part that we want showing of the hem and the trim touching the right side of the pillowcase. And then we're going to pin. So that should look like this. And then we will pin it along here. And then this is what it will look like when we are, after we stitch that seam. So you can kind of double check with yourself to see if you've lined it up correctly before you stitch it. So we're going to just stack these. You want all of these raw edges of fabric lined up exactly on top of each other. Again, this is a little bit off lengthwise, so we'll just trim that later. Okay, so now we'll pin that and stitch it. This says a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I like to start in the center and work my way to the edges when I pin these types of pieces. And since you have your basting line facing up, when you go to stitch it, you can actually make sure that you are stitching on the correct side of that line. It's just another way of checking to make sure things are correctly placed. Okay, now we're going to sew all of these together. The last time we used the machine, we did a basting stitch. Therefore, we need to adjust our stitch length to make sure that it's a more secure stitch. So we're going to go down to about a 2.8 is probably more realistic for this seam. On my sewing machine, there is a line for a 1/2 inch seam allowance between the 5/8 inch and the 3/8 inch line. So this line right here is where I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric. I do want to reverse this time. So I've got all 4 layers here. So 1 of the main fabric, 2 of the trim, and then 1 of the hem. So my edge of my fabric is right here with my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and there is my presser foot down. So we'll be actually stitching about right here next to our basting, which is absolutely what it should be. I'm going to reverse this time. Okay, then I'm going to keep the edge of my fabric on my 1/2 inch seam allowance line. Oops, I kind of went off. Gotta go back. If that happens, you just stop, trim, and reline up your presser foot onto your stitch plate. Sorry, reline up your edge of your fabric on your stitch plate. And then you just stitch over the stitches you just did, and that blends them without having any kind of a step in the seam. It's a nice smooth transition. Okay. Okay, I didn't wait to step off the end of my fabric here because that's where the end of this fabric was. So that's why I did not go all the way to the end of the hem fabric. Okay, so you should have shorter stitches next to your basting stitches. The next thing we're going to do is press our seam allowance and grade our seams, which means reduce some of that bulk. So we're going to trim our fabrics so that they are not quite so chunky in one spot. Always trim your tails. It's a sign of quality work. Okay, I have my fabric on my ironing board here. And now we're going to grade the seams. So by grading our seams, that reduces the amount of bulk that these seams create when you fold things inside. So rather than having a big step where the end of the fabric is, it just sort of gradually tapers off, and then it doesn't wear as easily, doesn't wear out as quickly in that spot. So that's kind of what we want to grade a seam for. So what we're going to do is make sure none of our fabric that we don't want cut is underneath. And we are going to trim one fabric shorter than the other. So since these two fabrics are basted together, I'm actually going to separate them with my blade. So I'm just going to sneak in there with the tip of my blade and just trim just the hem fabric. And so that's what that's going to look like all the way across. And then I'm going to get in there with the tip of my scissors and trim the trim piece, the trim fabric, slightly longer than that. So it'll look something like this. And that just kind of makes the transition from one fabric to the next a little smoother, and your project maybe won't wear out as quickly in the wash, and also it'll iron better when you're working, and you won't have such a big lump of fabric to stitch over when you go to line those up to stitch together. Okay, I've got all my seam allowances graded. And the next thing that we're going to do, I know it doesn't say it in the instructions, but it's so important, is we're going to do some pressing. So I like to iron down. Yes, iron. We're pushing along and we're moving our iron. We want to get our seam allowances nice and flat. And then we are going to, without removing this crease that we made in the very first step, we're going to press our hem fabric down so that our trim piece is actually facing the opposite direction. And this is going to be nice and flat here. This will really help you line things up when it's time to do the French seam. And having this nice and flat really makes it look nice. And I'm disappointed that my tailor's chalk left this greasy mark. But it will wash out. Or this is my sample, so hopefully we'll just be more cautious with yours. Okay, so now we're going to have a nice flat trim piece. We did not destroy that crease that we need. And now we're going to go back to our work table and we're going to... Okay, so this is step 6 in the instructions. And it says to fan fold the fabric from the case so that it can be encased into the hem fabric. So this is what that looks like. This is how we get a burrito. You're just going to fold. I actually just like to keep folding it like this, to be honest. I think it is more effective. The main point of this folding is to keep this main pillowcase fabric out of your way when you stitch the hem fabric down. One more. And then you make sure you kind of pull this seam that you have with your trim fabric, that sandwich that we made and graded that seam. You're going to pull it up and meet. So right sides together now with the hem. So this is the outside of the hem fabric. And we've got our burrito that we've just created. And we're going to grab our seam that we just pressed and graded, and we're going to line it up with the other layers of fabric. So since we graded these ones, we're actually just going to line up the case fabric with the edge of the hem fabric. You just kind of work that all the way down, line it all up. The main thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is not getting this pillowcase fabric caught in your pinning when you pin, because that part will come out easily when we unwrap the burrito after we're stitching. So we're going to pin. Something you can do also to keep your burrito out of the way is to make sure it's smooth and then put a pin down here all along. That will keep your pillowcase fabric out of the sandwich and the seam that you are creating. I like to pin where my seam is going to be. And then I like to put a few this direction just to keep my burrito out of the way. This is how you create your burrito. You rolled up your fabric, and now we're going to pin it. Since we graded that seam, it's actually going to be the pillowcase fabric that lines up with the hem fabric on the bottom. Put a couple more pins here to keep our burrito fabric from sneaking into the seam. Okay, now we're going to stitch this burrito with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So since we graded our seam already, we're actually going to just line up the edge of our 2 layers with our 1/2 inch seam allowance marking on our stitch plate. We're going to use a regular straight stitch again. Now, if we did our 1/2 inch seam allowance correctly on this time, we can actually just sew exactly right on those same stitches. So I'm going to anchor my seam here by reversing, and then I'm just going to actually stitch right on those same stitches. This is where I went off before. I didn't have to take those stitches out because they're not going to be on this side of the seam. It happens. Our burrito pins are keeping the fabric out of the way. I'm using white thread because I want you to be able to see my stitches, but ideally you would be using a thread that matches your fabric. Okay, now we're going to take out these pins that were keeping our burrito back. And then we're going to actually pull our burrito through this casing that we just made. And then you'll see this casing that we just made. And then you'll see this magic trick. So all you do is you reach your hand inside the burrito and you pull the pillowcase fabric that you rolled up, pull that out of that casing that you just made. You kind of made a little tube. So now you have raw edges on your hem and raw edges all the way down, and it's unfolded, and that raw edge, all of those seams that you graded are now inside the hem fabric. So it's a nice clean finish. So now we're going to iron. Make sure this is nice and flat again. And then we are going to line up our fabrics and make our French seam. Okay, make sure that to smooth your hem fabric this direction, use some steam. You really want to get a nice sharp crease. You're going to push this seam allowance down so you have a nice flat surface here. Okay, and then you're actually going to turn it over and do this other side. You're going to push this part of the seam down and away from the pillowcase fabric. This really makes a nice finished product. Pressing on this side also. This hem should be nice and sharp crease here at the bottom. Now, if you're not getting what you want, you can spray it too. I think the irons at school also spray. You want lots of steam and pressure. Okay, so you should have nice flat trim and hem on both sides. You might have to trim a couple of our raw edges here. And then we are going to do our French seam. So we want our pillowcase to be in half, wrong sides together. Okay, this is what I said before when our edges weren't quite lining up. That's kind of what I was talking about. So we're going to actually straighten that out and trim it so that it is straight. So you want to make sure that your hem fabric, your folds are lined up exactly together. And then your seam here should also be lined up exactly together. Okay, so if those two things are lined up exactly together, then we're going to work our way this direction with our marking. So it looks like, we're going to smooth this out. So it looks like our hem fabric is what is too wide. Well, I'm going to take my grid ruler here and I'm going to line it up on the edge of my hem fabric. And then I'm going to mark. So there is, line my line up right exactly parallel to the fold and see. So we're going to line up our folded edges of our hem and our raw edges. And then we're going to pin. And then you need to pin all the way around the rest of your pillowcase. Now we're going to do our French seam. So you're going to start back here at the fold of your pillowcase and you are going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the raw edge. So the 1/4 on my machine is the edge of my presser foot. So that's what we're going to be following. You do want to keep your regular stitch length and you do want to reverse when you start and stop. I do see that my raw edges are not exactly lined up, but I think that this is how it is not twisted. So I smoothed it as best I could, and that's just going to have to be trimmed. So when we get to the corner here, we have to leave our needle in the fabric so that we can turn and not lose our place. That's called pivoting. So we're coming to the, okay, and then if you are worried that you might go over with your foot pedal, you can walk your stitches with your hand wheel. And I think that that's about 1/4 inch from this edge. So then you lift up your presser foot, leave your needle in the fabric, and then you just turn your fabric. And then I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance again. So you should be able to see my little corner. Ideally, my edges would be lined up perfectly, but my fabric is smooth and these points are lined up correctly. So I'm just going to make my seam straight. I'll trim that off later. Now, as you come to the trim, you want to make sure that you're not catching the trim and pushing it in the wrong direction. We want to keep the trim in that direction. So kind of peek underneath, make sure the trim is still in that direction, and kind of go slowly. I don't really like to take my pins out when I'm trying to keep them marking something like this, so I just carefully drive over them. I'm going to reverse when I get to the end. Fourth inch seam allowance. Trim your tails, take out your pins. Then we're going to go to the ironing board and trim our seam and do some pressing. So I actually grabbed a knitting needle while I was away, and we're going to need that. So what you're going to do now is trim your seam so it's nice and close to your stitching line like we did with our French seam. I'm going to iron it real quick here. Okay, so we trimmed our corner and then we graded our seams. We trimmed them, we did not grade them. They're both the same width. So that's what that should look like all the way around. Here is the corner. I need to trim just a tiny bit more. There. Okay, so now we are going to open our pillowcase to the wrong side, turn it inside out basically. And then I like to put it on the ironing board to get a nice sharp seam. So you just slip it over the edge of your ironing board here. And this is where the knitting needle comes in really handy. You just take it and you kind of poke out the corner with your knitting needle. You just need to be careful not to push too hard because you can actually go clear through the fabric with your knitting needle. So you want some nice sharp seams there. We are going to press this seam open all the way around. Might be kind of tricky when we get to the corner, but we're going to turn the corner like this. This part is going to get wrinkled, but we are focused on this part, so that's what we're going to work on. The rest of the wrinkles can come out when we flatten the pillowcase. So now we're just going to kind of get in here with our tip of our iron and go into the corner. Okay, now we're going to flatten our seams for our French seam. Flatten these seams so that we can do another 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. That will encase the cut edges of our fabric, the raw edges. You want to make sure that no side is showing more than the other. And here my seams are lined up exactly. So we're just going to continue around here, flatten this, and then we'll go back and stitch our 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to pin it again, so we're going to hold it here, make sure those are lined up So you pinch it where you want it, and then you roll it down together. You roll your fingers together to get that to stay. And quite honestly, that is the only pin I'm going to put in. Right into the seam there. Okay, so now I'm going to reverse again at the beginning and the end and pivot in the corner. I'm going to leave my needle down in the fabric and I'm going to lift my presser foot to turn. So here we go. I'm coming to my corner, so I'm going to slow down. And you can feel where you graded your seam there, so I'm going to make sure that my needle is down at the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Lift up my presser foot and turn. And then we're going to, now we have our pillowcase right side out. Our French seam has encapsulated all of the raw edges. And we are going to now poke out the corners with our handy knitting needle here. Make sure they're nice and sharp. We don't like these corners that don't make a square corner here. Okay. Now we're going to iron. Again, stick it on the edge of your ironing board and then pick a side to press your seam allowance, the direction. It kind of just lays one way better than the other, so just that can be the side. You want to flatten this seam nice and flat. And then you want to turn the corner with it here. This part here is going to get wrinkled, we know. So you're going to flatten this part of the seam here. And now that we've wrinkled that part in the process, we are going to lay it down like this and iron the entire pillowcase. Here's the finished product.